Welcome everyone to UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law, the virtual version. I want to welcome you all here this evening for this discussion. And I'm always so happy to look outside the window of my office, which I guess is sort of right there, and to see people filing up the walk and in the door to be part of a community discussion. And as much as this is not the same thing, it's very much the equivalent to have this kind of discussion with all of you in your homes this evening. Our partnership with the ACLU is a community partnership that we are particularly proud of at the law school. And a lot of things have changed since we were welcoming presidential candidates to the law school throughout the fall and the winter, but a lot hasn't changed. The important discussions about who we are as a people, who we want to be locally, nationally, globally, those questions are more important than ever. And I often say that the law school is not just kind of a building next to White Park, but a living and breathing, vibrant part of the civil discourse of our community. And now that is true in so many ways as we have taken our work, and we're doing this evening, out into homes all across the region, including your home. And we're happy that you've joined us tonight to be a part of this discussion. Something that exemplifies our community mission at the law school is our Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service. And John Gravy, a professor at the law school, is director of the Rudman Center, and he does a fabulous job. John's work as a teacher, as a scholar, and as someone who just to his core is truly dedicated to the mission that the Rudman Center represents, makes it a joy to have him as a colleague. And also, if you haven't read his Constitutional Connections column in the Concord Monitor, my tip to you for the day is to check them out, including yesterday's, this weekend, on the Supreme Court's recently concluded term. So John, thank you for all the work that you do in the community. Thank you for bringing this opportunity to the school. And I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Megan. It's very nice. Good evening, everyone, and a virtual welcome to the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service. The Rudman Center provides curricular, experiential, and financial support for law students interested in public service legal careers. The center also serves as a face of the University of New Hampshire here in Concord by presenting public programming, such as tonight's event, that aligns with its mission. We are so pleased to partner with the ACLU of New Hampshire to continue this series on civil liberties. We now turn our attention to the New Hampshire Governor's Office. Tonight, we welcome Executive Councillor Andru Volinsky, who is a candidate for the New Hampshire Democratic Party's gubernatorial nomination. Councillor Volinsky has represented New Hampshire's 2nd District as Executive Councillor since 2017. He has had a long and distinguished career as a public interest lawyer, serving as lead counsel in the Claremont School District versus Governor of New Hampshire litigation, which established a right to an education under the New Hampshire Constitution. Moderating this evening's presentation will be Jeannie Hruska from the ACLU of New Hampshire. We will be taking questions through the Q&A function that you see down at the bottom of your screen. You will not be able to see your question, but trust that the panelists will. Please confine your questions to issues of civil liberties. With that, I am very pleased to turn things over to Executive Councillor Andru Volinsky. Welcome, Councillor.
Thank you, John. Hi, Jeannie. Thank you, Reed and Olivia, for interpreting. Hello to Megan. Hello to everyone in the audience. So let's start here. We're obviously in the middle of a multi-headed crisis. It's COVID, it's economic, it's healthcare, it's climate change, it's racial injustice. Now is the time for bold ideas and courageous leadership. Those of us who've worked hard on civil liberties issues know that we build coalitions. That's how we challenge those resistant to advancing the cause of civil liberties. And those coalitions change from issue to issue. The Coalition for Reproductive Rights is different from the coalition to abolish the death penalty, and maybe different again on more general criminal justice issues. But all of these coalitions need to be bound together by a vision. My vision is that we have a diverse, green New Hampshire in which everyone can participate in our state's prosperity. Diverse, green, everyone participates. As John mentioned, I was the lead lawyer in the Claremont school funding case. I organized a team of 18 volunteer lawyers who exposed just how unfairly our schools are funded and how the quality of a child's education depends on where she lives. We went further than just exposing the problem. We convinced the Supreme Court to recognize a constitutional right to a state-funded public education, the first time that public education was recognized as a constitutional right during the first 200 years of our state's existence. That was a bold idea, but due to a lack of courageous leadership, we never fulfilled the promise of Claremont. Seniors continue to be worried about whether they can stay in their homes or will the ever-rising property tax put them out. Children still have educations of varying quality in different parts of the state. Taxpayers who are willing to pay their fair share, but not 2 and 3 and 4 times their fair share. And young people still have trouble, working people have trouble getting into their first homes because of the property tax, because the state has never complied with the Claremont decisions. Look, when I first went to Claremont, it was like going home for me. I grew up in a mill town where the mill failed. My dad was a mechanic and a maintenance man and a union shop steward. My mother was a homemaker. I'm the only one in my family to go to college. I went on scholarship. I paid for law school by working as a carpenter. I understand the importance of educational opportunity. It's a matter of economic justice. The issues we raised in Claremont and that are still unresolved, that's why I'm running for governor, to fulfill the promise of Claremont. I don't want to miss in this forum on civil liberties the importance of climate change. Climate change is an existential threat, and it has significant racial implications. We need to take direct action to combat climate change. The time for half measures is long gone. There's no excuse for one more fracked gas pipeline. And I'm proud to say I'm the only candidate in this race who opposed the Granite Bridge pipeline and who doesn't think adding more fracked gas to our fossil fuel usage in New Hampshire makes any sense. Look, I have a significant history of working on civil liberties issues. I was a board member of the New Hampshire branch of the American Civil Liberties Union for almost 10 years. I was its legal counsel for almost 6 years. I only left that position to become the lead lawyer in the Claremont case. We all talk about the importance of Claremont as far as taxation and education are concerned, but there's another piece of Claremont that I'm very proud of. And that is, for the first time, we convinced the New Hampshire Supreme Court to recognize us acting as a private attorney general and being entitled to compensation when we prove the state has violated our clients' constitutional rights. That right continues to today, and I'm proud to say that other civil liberties lawyers are using that cause of action to fund their actions on behalf of clients. In addition to that work, I've been a capital defense lawyer defending cases in Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, and before the US Supreme Court for almost 40 years. My most recent case happened in January, where my client of 30 years was scheduled to be executed in Georgia. He didn't want his mother to witness the education, so he asked me to be his witness. I left the campaign trail for a week, and with some other lawyers in Georgia, we did a last-ditch Hail Mary hearing before the Board of Pardon and Parole in Georgia. And as I was sitting with him and his mom, 5 hours before his execution, one of the other members of our team walked in and said, "Your sentence has been commuted." It was the 10th commutation by the Board of Paroles in Georgia since 1976. That's how infrequent it was. I'm very proud of that work that I've done through the Southern Center for Human Rights for so many years. I'm so proud to be here tonight with you to talk about civil liberties. It's a critically important subject for the governorship and for our state. I'm happy to be here to answer your questions. Let's start with those questions.
Thank you, Councillor. Before we get to the Q&A, if you'll permit me, I would like to read the ACLU of New Hampshire's land recognition statement. As this event takes place on Indakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present, this land continues to be unceded. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the Albonak who have stewarded Indakina throughout the generations. We also recognize that these peoples are currently lacking federal recognition in the United States. And with that, I just want to remind folks, we are going to field questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, but I am going to take the liberty of being the moderator to ask you the first question. And that's about a topic that's gaining a lot of momentum in response to the will of the people, in response to street protests around the country. And that is the pursuit of racial justice. And as governor, as the highest office in the state, leadership is pertinent on this issue. So I'll ask you, do you believe that systemic racism exists in New Hampshire? And if so, what would you do to address it as governor?
So it's clear that systemic racism does exist in New Hampshire. It's a point on which I differ dramatically from our current governor, who denies the existence of systemic racism. We also have overt racism in our state. It was only 1991 that the KKK met in Rochester. It was only 2017 that a young boy was almost lynched in Claremont. And it was this last Memorial Day that a Black man was stopped in Albany, New Hampshire, tased and pulled out of his car by his hair. So we have both kinds. And it's evident from disproportionately poor healthcare outcomes for Black and brown people. Same is true, more harsh penalties, less access to bail, all of that breaks on racial lines. It's evidence of systemic racism. So here's what I do. Start with recognizing the people who are working so hard on this issue, the Black Lives Matters leaders, the NAACP leaders, others who are raising up this issue, acknowledge their work. I would then focus on law enforcement. We have the advantage of having a single police training academy. That's a place where we can improve training, include implicit bias training. I went through implicit bias training in 2017, work on enhancing skills at de-escalating conflicts and improving mediation skills. It's the place where we start to demilitarize the police and diversify the police. We need to recruit from out of state as well as in state to have a more diverse police force. That's number one. Number two, I spent 6 years on the board of the Manchester Community Health Center. It's a federally qualified health center. It has a requirement that the board is majority clients of the center. So I served with new Americans and learned a great deal from the experience. It's the agency that provides the most primary and preventative medical care for impoverished groups in the Manchester area. We need to build out that backbone of health centers so that we can improve healthcare access broadly across the state until we're able to get to a federal single payer system, which is what I ultimately support us doing. School funding is always a big issue for me. Education is a place where we can make a difference. But Manchester, our most diverse city, 43% diverse student population, has the lowest school spending in the state. by thousands of dollars, and it shows. So we need to do more than just equalize the funding. We need to introduce racially, ethnically, culturally diverse curricula, and we need to diversify the teaching force and the administrative force so that we have more Black and brown teachers in our schools who can serve as role models. Finally, we know that a disproportionate number of Black and brown members of our community are living in or near poverty. And so dealing with minimum wage, getting us to $15 an hour, dealing with the extremely low cap on unemployment in New Hampshire, $427, those are things that will disproportionately help Black and brown people, and we need to work on that as well.
Thank you for that. You mentioned implicit bias training for law enforcement. Can I ask, would you require that all of your staff go through implicit bias training? Can you talk about how you would use your staff, your appointments, to also promote racial justice?
So the easy answer is yes. My staff would go through implicit bias training, and it certainly helps me to go through it again. It's, you know, you're trying to change a lifetime of thinking about things in a certain way and not being aware of other things. So coming through it multiple times makes sense. I wouldn't ordinarily say this, but you asked. My campaign staff is incredibly diverse. That was intentional. So my deputy finance manager is a young Black woman from Virginia. My campaign finance manager grew up in foster care. My campaign manager is an Asian American woman. We had, for a short time, one male staff member on our team. And it's an opportunity to raise people up into positions where they're visible. And I think that's really important. Before I ran for governor, I ran an office of a large law firm here in New Hampshire. The office was in Manchester. I went out of my way to recruit a young Black lawyer and a Latina lawyer to our staff. They both became partners in the firm. That's intentional. And I would do the same in looking for people to staff my administration if I'm lucky to win this race.
Thank you. I want to go to an intersection between racial justice and privacy, and that relates to the issue of facial recognition technology. We had legislation about this past session, and in response to the protests that have been seen across the country in recent months, a number of jurisdictions have taken action to ban the use of facial recognition technology. It's unreliable, but it's particularly unreliable when identifying people of color. And so can I ask you, as governor, would you support legislation to prohibit the use of facial recognition technology by the state of New Hampshire?
Put it on my desk, I'll sign it.
If elected, I will hold you to that.
I expect you to.
I have a couple questions that were actually submitted ahead of time by Chris Emerson, and I want to make sure we get those in.
Sure.
So it's a two-part question, but we'll start with the first part, which is, too often in this state, people who are deaf or hard of hearing are required to arrange and pay for their own interpretation when interacting with state agencies. Would you support requiring state agencies to employ at least a part-time American Sign Language interpreter and allocating specific funding for this in the state budget?
I'll just let Reed catch up. Look, I view this as a part of governmental transparency. I'm a big proponent of governmental transparency. If we make governmental hearings, governmental activities opaque to certain people because they can't hear them, we are not being transparent. And so I don't have any hesitation in supporting the idea of having people on staff who can interpret, who are qualified ASL interpreters. I've had this position for quite some time. I actually, as a young lawyer in Tennessee, tried a case for a profoundly deaf young man who had not learned ASL. It was an incredibly eye-opening experience to work with him in a serious felony case and to work in a courtroom where we had to use two interpreters, one into ASL and then a second to his level of understanding.
Would you support including money in the budget for that? This is New Hampshire. Inevitably, the budget, a lot of things get cut from it. And I can imagine this being one of those services that would get cut in financially tight times.
You know, I think it's important for governors to put their money where their mouth is. If you believe in transparency, you got to fund efforts like you've described.
And on that same note, just the second part to Chris's question, as governor, would you commit to having ASL interpretation automatically and consistently available at your press events and having that interpretation visible on TV screens when your events are covered by TV outlets?
Yes. Actually, this was an issue that I raised with our governor when he started doing press conferences and wasn't separating or wearing masks and didn't have ASL interpreter at the start. So I've already raised it with our governor, and yes, I would follow that practice.
On the issue of interpretation, I'll ask a somewhat related question, which is about voting rights. And right now in New Hampshire, we provide ballots in English only, which can make it difficult to access voting rights for people for whom English is a second language. So as governor, would you support providing ballots in a language other than English to ensure that all eligible voters are able to participate in our democracy?
So I don't want to embarrass him, so I won't name him, but I've already raised the failure of the Secretary of State's office to put Spanish language instructions on the Secretary's website. It wasn't the Secretary who I spoke with. And I was given the same old line. We don't meet the federal threshold of a sufficient number of Spanish language speakers to require it. And quite frankly, I said I didn't care whether we had enough Spanish language speakers. We have Spanish language voters. It's such a minimal burden to translate. Why wouldn't we do it?
I agree. I'm going to take a question from the QA function, which is from Kristen Porter. The question is, LGBTQ older adults are among the most vulnerable in the state. Our neighbor, Massachusetts, has elevated these concerns by creating a Massachusetts Commission on LGBT Aging and supporting an LGBT ombudsperson. As governor, would you support a similar commission and appointment?
So I'm going to take a deep breath so that our interpreters can swap. It's been right around a half hour. To be honest, I think there are a number of issues that require the work of a commission. How we treat LGBTQ people, aging or not aging, is one area of concern. How we implement some of the things I talked about around racial diversity is another area. We have a whole set of problems in dealing with children and families in our state. The legislature created the Office of Ombudsman. That's worked really well. I think that's a good model, but it's a completely under-resourced position. So we need to figure out, and I have to do this with the legislature, how we put into place commissions that will deal with all of these issues, and how these commissions don't become just the writers of reports that get stuck on somebody's shelf. So these have to be living, breathing documents that really implement the concerns that are raised and fleshed out in these commission settings. So I want some latitude on how to best do this. I hear the concern. It's a really valid concern. But in the context of our small state government, I'm just a tiny bit hesitant to commit to a commission specific to this purpose.
While we're on the issue of LGBTQ rights, I have another question which relates specifically to the powers of the governor. In 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed federally, and yet the US military, which is the largest employer of transgender individuals nationwide, has begun a ban on transgender service members. Several governors have issued executive orders to allow transgender individuals to continue serving openly in the National Guard. At a time when each state's National Guard is being mobilized to aid COVID-19 responses, including in medical sites and to operate polls, as we saw in Wisconsin, would you issue an executive order to allow transgender individuals to continue serving in the New Hampshire National Guard?
I think the ban is abhorrent. And I would issue an order that reverts against the ban. And so, yes, I would. And there's there's another issue with transgendered individuals. It's the X mark for non-binary on license plates. That should be a self-determination. There should be no requirement for a medical certification that you're entitled to the X. If you believe you're entitled to the X, if you live as though you're entitled to the X, you're entitled to the X.
And do you feel that also then applies to birth records, that you should be able to self-attest for a third gender marker on both?
I do.
So we've had a number of questions that relate to criminal justice reform. And so I want to kind of open that topic with an overarching question, which is we use that term often, criminal justice reform, without actually defining what justice means. And so as candidate for governor, I'll ask you, what do you think justice means? And do you think it's achieved currently by the criminal legal system?
Well, you know, I was a public defender for 5 years. I practiced criminal law as a private lawyer. As I mentioned, I've been a death penalty lawyer for almost 40 years. We do not have a criminal justice system. We have a criminal system. Justice is often a fleeting glance as the door closes behind you. Some of the prisons that I've been in, the conditions are inhumane. And let me say, we think we're immune from this. We have a part of the New Hampshire State Prison for Men, the receiving unit, where new prisoners go for their first 6 to 8 weeks. It is from the 1850s. There is no air conditioning there. The windows don't fully operate. During this time of year, the temps in the cells are over 90 degrees. That is an inhumane condition, and we should discontinue that wing of the prison. In order to do that, we have to reduce the prison population, which should be our goal. Criminal justice implies that the penalty fits the crime. If you commit a crime, this is what happens to you. There needs to be recognition that it's a crime, it's not a person. The person is going to come back to society. We have to make arrangements for that to happen in a way that's productive for the person and for society. If punishment is deserved, and many times it is, it should be no more than is necessary. I've seen judges just get angry and load up on the defendant and issue a sentence that is out of proportion to the wrong because there's something about the defendant who is different or upsets the judge in some way. That is not justice. I've seen in death penalty cases, we've seen it in our own state. If you are a white person of means and you hire someone intentionally to perform a murder, you avoid the death penalty. If you're a young black man and you shoot a police officer as you're fleeing without a forethought, you get the death penalty. That's an example of how unjust our system is. So part of it is resources. Criminal defendants are entitled to resources. We happen to have a good public defender service here in our state, but they're often begging for resources from a court. So we need access to resources. The disproportionality in bail needs to get addressed. The use of chokeholds, I know that chokeholds were banned under a recent amendment, but the state didn't change its justification statute. So the ban is undermined by the statute that says you can use that force if you reasonably believe it's necessary. One undoes the other. That's not justice. If we're going to ban chokeholds, we should ban them. Period. End of sentence. So that's kind of a convoluted answer, Jeannie, I'm sorry. But there's a lot to the question of justice. And, you know, a lot of this is economic justice. A lot of this is mental health justice. Police officers are asked to be social workers and psychiatrists while they're performing a law enforcement function. That's not fair to them, and they certainly can't do that job well. So we need to get resources that are appropriate for the task.
Well, you mentioned penalties a few times, and we have a punishment system right now. And so going off of that, and also coming with a couple of the questions in the chat, right now, our number one way for dealing with homelessness, for dealing with drug use, and often for dealing with mental health is incarceration. That's all we've got to throw at it too often. Right. Do you think incarceration, which is a penalty, solves any of those issues? Of course not. You know, when we're talking about homelessness, we need to think of a housing first model. We don't have that. I sit on the executive council where we approve the receipt of grants to deal with homelessness. We have almost no state money going into addressing homelessness. It's all federal money that flows down, and it's insufficient to the task. So you get homeless people in stable housing, you add some case management, you add some mental health therapy and support, then you have a system that's not punitive, that can help people move out of homelessness in a way that, from the state's view, would be more cost effective. It costs $37,000 a year to house someone in prison, and they get no benefit as far as stabilizing their life on the outside. And so if we were smart and put some of that money to a housing first model, we could save the cost of incarceration, help improve the chance for a better life for some of the people who are suffering from addiction and from mental health problems. Yeah, you mentioned the $37,000 a year, which is the price tag for one person to be incarcerated. That money obviously means less money for a whole bunch of other things, including drug treatment. So the question on how do we treat drug use, would you support as governor either decriminalizing or legalizing small amounts of drugs so that the money saved from prosecuting and incarcerating those folks could then actually be transferred and spent on treatment or on prosecuting drug traffickers, the really big heavy lifters, rather than the folks using drugs who actually need help? So I take it you're not talking about decriminalizing marijuana. You're talking about... You can start there, but I'm really hoping you go beyond that. Yeah, no, I intend to go beyond it, but I think you've created a false dichotomy. The dichotomy is not you have to decriminalize or everyone goes to jail. There are lots of gradations in between. I don't think New Hampshire or US society is ready for decriminalization of drugs other than marijuana. And I think that's a big step without taking the intermediate steps of not incarcerating everyone who's been convicted of possession or use of a hard drug. With respect to marijuana, that's easy. People say we've decriminalized, we haven't. So 18 to 21-year-olds are guilty of a crime if they are found in possession of any amount of marijuana. That's a big mistake. That saddles them with a criminal record for the start of their work life,
for the start of their educational experience after public ed. That's a big wrong turn. We need to fix that. We need to legalize marijuana for adult use in New Hampshire with the normal safeguards. We don't have to caveat it to death, but it needs to be legal. It's legal in all the surrounding states and in Canada. There's no reason for us to be different on that.
You mentioned,
and it's your research that shows that Black and brown people are more often arrested and prosecuted. You know, if you hire the good lawyer, that good lawyer will talk the prosecutor out of the prosecution. It's only the people who go to court without lawyers, who are in poverty, get arrested for marijuana, that get stuck with that record. That makes it harder for them to get a good job. Makes no sense.
yeah, we absolutely have racial disparities in our arrest and incarceration rates here in New Hampshire. But you mentioned that there's a gradation between punishment and decriminalization, which there is. And I just am interested in you spelling it out a little more. So as governor, for people who get picked up for personal drug use, right? They're not dealers, they're users. How would you have the system handle those folks?
Well, in some parts of the state, we have functioning drug courts. In other parts of the state, we have drug courts that don't function so well. So you need enlightened judges to have a well-functioning drug court. But there are opportunities for people to come into a drug court system, comply with rehabilitative requests by the court, and leave without a conviction, or leave with probationary supervision instead of incarceration. I think those steps make a lot of sense.
I have one specific question from Marcia Garber, which is, do you believe in restorative justice for New Hampshire? Would you believe building out an actual restorative justice program in New Hampshire?
I think I need to know more about what Marcia intends with that term. I'm familiar with some different aspects of restorative justice, but it's a big term and means a lot of different things to different people.
I think what she's getting at is an alternative to the prosecutorial incarceration road that our criminal legal system is pretty much set on, and creating an alternative where you have communities involved and you have the person who is charged with an offense involved in apologizing for and seeking forgiveness and going through actions to address what they did, right? So you have a restorative model versus a punitive model.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities for that. Again, it takes an enlightened judge to oversee the process. It takes an enlightened prosecutor. But I mean, as a public defender, I've had cases like that. It wasn't in a formal system, but it was a system where we could tell there was an opening with the victim of the crime for the person who was accused to come forward and make amends in appropriate ways. And it worked. It's not appropriate for all cases. And so you have to have the appropriate supervision where it does make sense.
If you're willing, I want to touch upon immigration, which is actually a pretty relevant issue here in New Hampshire, because we've had a number of immigration checkpoints set up along I-93 for the last several years, causing a number of problems. And we've been frustrated by kind of the lack of leadership in calling out the checkpoints and calling out the federal government and calling upon the federal government to stop this. We've seen that kind of leadership in some other states. So as governor, would you take a stand against these immigration checkpoints? And if so, what would you do about them?
So I actually, a couple of summers ago, was going hiking up north and saw the checkpoint on the southbound lane. So I turned around and came back so I could experience the checkpoint. But as I'm going through it, I realized I'm a white guy. And then I'd forgotten that I was driving my truck, which has the official #2 license plate on it. So it was not the experience that other people got. So yes, I would call it out. There are some limits to what I can do to stop it. But there are no limits to what I can do to ask my Department of Transportation commissioner to put on one of those electronic signs 10 miles up the road before that checklist, that checkpoint. And so I wouldn't hesitate if we don't get cooperation to announce there's an upcoming checkpoint.
That's one, we've actually asked that if there is an immigration checkpoint, as soon as the state knows, that it amplify that and make it public.
Well, you've probably seen the electronic billboards for DWI stops.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same notion and should be just as readily available.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pull a question from viewers, which is a simple one. What is your stance on no excuse absentee voting?
We should have no excuse absentee voting. You know, my son and his family happen to live in Denver. So all registered voters without a request in Colorado and in Denver where he lives get the ballot in the mail. It just comes. And then if he wants to, he can still go to a polling place, or there are receptacles that look like post boxes where he can just walk up, drop his completed ballot in. That's what we should have in New Hampshire.
I'm going to broaden that question because voting rights is a pretty controversial issue in this state when it really shouldn't be. And so we've seen some changes to voting rights laws this year in response to COVID-19, but I'm going to kind of ask you a broad question, which is if you were governor and had the ability to work with the legislature, how would you broaden voting rights to make sure that every eligible voter can access the polling station, but also to ensure that our elections are safe and secure?
So you know that before taking office, I was a voting protection lawyer for about 20 years. I was the deputy chief on the Obama campaign. I was in court for the Obama campaign in 2008. I always was assigned either Dartmouth or UNH, the typical hotspots during every presidential election. This is an issue that's really serious to me. So here's how I think of it, and you said it. The goal is everyone who's eligible should be able to vote without impediments. Part of that starts with making registration easier. Registration now is through your town hall or your city hall. We should make registration available at every appropriate clerical state office. So that would include the courthouses, that would include the DMV offices. With the next Secretary of State, who may be competent at using technology, I would open it up to being able to register online. Right now, I'm not that comfortable with the Secretary's office and their ability to use technology. So I'm hesitant to go there. So after you register, you should be able to vote absentee without excuse. We should mail the ballots. The voting that's happening September 8th, which is the primary, will happen in places where many of the poll workers are north of 70. That's a dangerous group to be exposed during the COVID pandemic. I've advocated for and said this to the Secretary's office. You need to spend money to recruit and train people early in the summer, over the course of the summer, so that we have well-trained, a little bit younger poll workers who aren't immunocompromised. We should have been doing that. We need an accounting for all of the HAVA money, Help America Votes Act money. It's not clear where all that money is gone or where it's sitting. And we could use it to upgrade the websites that give you instruction, the balloting, the poll locations, and taking a hard look at the equipment we're using. So all of that.
Comprehensive list. I want to go to the issue of police reform. which has similarly been getting a lot of attention these last few months, along with racial justice. And Governor Sununu has created a commission on police reform, which the ACLU of New Hampshire is a member of. But I want to ask you a very specific question, which is New Hampshire specific. The New Hampshire Department of Justice maintains a secret list of over 200 police officers in the state accused of sustained misconduct. The list is secret, it's unknown to the public, so members of the public who are pulled over by police officers do not know if the officer pulling them over is on that list, if they have been found to have committed sustained misconduct. As governor, would you support making that list public?
So as a public defender and a criminal defense lawyer, I would often file motions to get just that information about the police officers involved in my cases under the Brady case. I think it's once a police officer has been given his or her due process and determined to have violated significant aspects of police procedures or laws or policies, I don't think it should be secret. And I don't think officers with that kind of disciplinary record should be permitted to transfer from department to department, often with the second department not knowing because the officer left because he was pushed and didn't want to fight. That's a problem. We have to depend on the honesty, the absence of corruption of law enforcement, and I think making those findings public. And the other thing is many police departments, the smaller ones, are supervised by their townspeople at town meeting in their budget process. And if there are officers who have long disciplinary records, the townspeople have the right to know that and to encourage the departure of those officers.
On the issue, which you kind of hinted at in terms of making sure that police officers who have committed sustained misconduct can't just leap from one police department to another, would you support stronger regulations in terms of decertification, that if officers are found to have committed sustained misconduct, that they be decertified?
So the premise of your question is a sensible one. I don't off the top of my head know the regulations that apply to decertification currently. So I'm hesitant to say we should make them tougher or weaker or change them without knowing them. I certainly agree that officers with disciplinary records without significant intervention, retraining, probation, whatever, should be decertified. You don't have a right to be a police officer.
That's well said. I'm going to change topics because I want to make sure we touch upon reproductive rights. And in New Hampshire, we're lucky in that we have pretty strong rights to abortion access. The issue is that second word, it's access, right? It's one thing to have the right, it's something else to be able to access that right. So as governor, what would you do to ensure that people can access their reproductive rights in New Hampshire?
Well, I sure as heck wouldn't renominate Gordon MacDonald to be our Chief Justice. So let's start there. We need a court that's balanced and fair when it comes to abortion rights. Access is often a question of affordability. The Hyde Amendment prohibits the use of federal money, which is what most of Medicaid is for abortion services. So I think it's 15 or 16 states have created a combination of separate funding sources or allow Medicaid funding, but they strip out the federal part for abortion services. I'm agnostic as to which methodology you should use, but we should have that kind of funding available.
I want to take a question from the chat, which is about children's rights. This question pertains to children. We have a child protection system in New Hampshire that is largely dysfunctional. DCYF is understaffed and underfunded. The number of available foster placements and institutional placements is insufficient. The district court family divisions are backlogged and cannot keep up with the agreed time limits. How do you propose to address this as governor?
This is one of our biggest problems. I've actually raised this issue a couple of times at the council. So last council meeting, we confirmed a deputy commissioner. Our outgoing deputy commissioner had a specialty and expertise in child and family services. And I specifically asked the current commissioner to replicate that with the next appointment, because this replacement doesn't have that expertise. She's a strong operational person, but not child and family. So we need expertise and leadership at the top. We need more resources. Part of the problem in keeping child protective workers is their inordinately high caseload. And you have a bit of a chicken and the egg. You can't bring down the caseload until you hire more child protective workers, but you can't hire them until you bring down the caseload. So part of the problem is we don't pay enough. It's a really, really hard job. One of my daughters happens to be a social worker, not in New Hampshire, but she and I talked about how difficult that child protection job is, and we need to put more resources there. The other thing is we can't introduce religious bias into the foster care system. During both my terms as counselor, Sununu put forward a contract for Bethany Christian Services to recruit and train potential foster parents, and they refused to work with same-sex couples. My first term, I was the only vote against that contract. My second term, Deborah Pignatelli voted against it with me, but the contract still passed 3-2. We should stop doing that. If you want to work in the foster care system, you should abide by the other human rights requirements that we have for state government.
I want to link this to what you talked about in your opening remarks about education and how much you prioritize education. And so linking police with education, you have the issue of SROs, security resource officers, which is police in schools. And again, in response to the movement around the country, there have been a number of jurisdictions that have removed SROs from school. So you don't have armed, uniformed officers handing out discipline in our schools. Can I ask you, what is your position on SROs in our schools?
So that social worker daughter just finished 5 years working at A. Randolph Phillips High School in New York City as a high school social worker. She was part of a team, very large high school. She dealt with all kinds of difficulties that the students experienced, from personal trauma to gang violence, to truancy, to food insecurity, to homelessness. All of that came to the social workers. She at times worked in tandem with the SROs. So I don't think SROs of and by themselves are necessarily bad. It's how you use them, it's how you deploy them, it's who they're working with. We talked earlier about asking law enforcement to do jobs for which they were not trained. Some of the SROs are put in exactly that position. At this New York City high school, they were able to work in tandem with the social workers, and it worked well. There were kids who were interacting with law enforcement, and it was helpful for those kids to have an SRO from the school working with them and the social worker. So I know that there's a view of SROs that they're completely inappropriate. I don't think they're completely inappropriate. I think it depends on how they're deployed, how they're used, and how they're trained.
So I like that you brought up your daughter who's a social worker on this, because that's one of the issues that sometimes comes up in the SRO conversation is you end up with SROs in schools where there is no social worker, right? There's just the officer. And so one of the big questions right now is we are a state with limited resources, and due to COVID-19, we have even fewer resources. So how do we prioritize scarce resources? So when it comes to schooling, what are your thoughts on that? How do you balance prioritizing one or the other, social workers or SROs?
Yes. You need both.
I feel like the issue of prioritization funding is a pretty big one for governor right now. So I'm going to push you on this.
So, but you're asking about a teeny tiny part of it. Do you prioritize SROs versus having social workers?
Well, if
The
you want
problems that we're going to have in funding are huge. You know, when coming out of 2008, the next 3 years under Speaker O'Brien, the property tax went up $294 million, the second most in New Hampshire history, because the state offloaded all of its responsibilities that it possibly could to the local communities and made us use the most unfair, unequal, unforgiving tax system to raise money at the local level. So if we're going to have a big discussion, that's the discussion we should have. We shouldn't have the discussion on SRO versus social worker as a matter of budgeting priorities. There are different aspects to that. Bigger priorities, we can't afford to offload state responsibilities onto the failed property tax system any more than we have. We need to walk that way back, because that is a civil liberties issue. The right to a public education is a constitutional right. That's where we need to be thinking about this.
Well, I'm going to push you on the budget issue. So I'll give you a broader question to answer it in, which is, we're part of this policing commission that's coming up with a number of recommendations. And I expect, based off of those recommendations, that law enforcement will be asking for more money from the state. And again, we are in a state with few resources and even fewer resources heading into January. So as governor, if you were overseeing next year's budget process, how would you handle this with law enforcement coming and saying, we need more money, but then you have the issue of public health, of mental health treatment, of drug treatment, all of these other services that are also wholly underfunded. So talk to me about your prioritization.
So my prioritization is also a product of thinking differently. Mm-hmm. So there are too many people that think every governmental expense is a cost to be minimized, when at times some governmental expenses are investments, and you nurture your investments. Education, infrastructure, they're prime examples of where you should be investing. I don't think you have to spend more on law enforcement to get them to do the job better. I think they need to be more efficient. I think we need to take advantage of alternatives to jail sentencing that are less expensive, so that we can create and free up money to do other things. So if you're telling me, how do we save money? I'd spend more money on parole and probation officers than I'd spend on correctional officers. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, you have to move people out of prison and into community settings where they're well supervised. Not everyone, mm-hmm. but we need to make the determination that some people can move. That frees up money. If we're talking about policing, there are ways of policing that are more effective and efficient, but don't necessarily cost more. There are responsibilities that we currently give to law enforcement that we should give to social workers. In those instances, I'm not going to pay more for a police officer to do a job that a social worker should be doing. So that's how I'd approach those priority issues. They're going to be tough. Look, we're going to need federal money to fill big holes, but we're going to have to be smart about it. We can't cut the entire Health and Human Services budget, because when we do that, we'll be paying for it for decades with damage to people's lives. And so we need to be careful where we're more efficient and careful where we continue to invest.
I appreciate you elaborating on that. And we are at the hour mark, but I did want to give you a chance to provide any closing remarks before we sign off.
Well, I think this is a really important dialogue. I know that you're going to have my friend Dan Feltus on. I hope you have Chris Sununu on as well to give him an opportunity to answer the.
Invited the governor. We sincerely hope that he accepts our invitation.
Well, he should. He and I will, shall I say, not align on a lot of these issues, but they're fair policy differences, and the voters should understand where those differences are. We take a very different approach to New Hampshire. As I said at the outset, diverse, green, everyone should participate in New Hampshire's prosperity. That's the approach I hope to take if I'm elected governor. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to Reed and Olivia. Thank you to UNH.
And I want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight. This was a great virtual turnout, which is the new way of things. But thank you, Councillor, for taking the time. And we look forward to seeing everybody on Thursday when we host Senator Feltus for our next iteration of Civil Liberties in the Corner Office. John, do you want to sign us off?
Just thank you for a spirited and interesting conversation. We'll see you all, or many of you, hopefully again on Thursday night.
Okay. Everyone stay safe. Be well.
You too.